Today, we are going to take on two subjects. The first is speciation, and this is the process of new species forming from existing species. Second, we're going to talk about the process of systematics, and this refers to things like how do we group species together into higher level groups, such as genera or families, and also how do we name these different groups. Before we move on, I should point out that in the background of this slide, you see some pretty cool looking cacti. These are cacti that grow on the Galapagos Islands. Because these islands are far from any mainland, they have relatively few species, and this paucity of other plants allowed the cacti to diverge into this unusual form when they reached this island. And so this is an example of a geographic barrier allowing speciation to occur. And we'll talk about that more as we talk about adaptive radiations soon. Here's our outline for today. We will start with speciation, the process, and we will talk about a few different ways this can happen. First, we will differentiate phyletic speciation versus divergent speciation. And we'll see that phyletic speciation is speciation that happens when one species gradually evolves into a new one over time. Divergent speciation is the process we'll be more interested in, and this is when one species diverges into two species that both occur at the same time. And this is what gives us species diversity. Next, we'll talk about the role of geographic and biological barriers in the process of speciation. So we'll see that there has to be something that separates populations, and that can either be a geographic barrier like mountains, or a biological barrier like a population having some plants that use one pollinator and other plants that use other pollinators. And third in this category of speciation, we'll talk about adaptive radiation. This is when one species fairly quickly evolves into many different species. Then in the second half, we are going to focus on systematics. We'll talk about the processes by which we as people decide what species are most likely closely related to other species. And we'll look at phylogenetic trees, which are the diagrams that we use to depict the relationships that we think occur between different species. Finally, we'll talk about some different taxonomic categories that we use to name different levels of relationships among species. So let's get started by reminding ourselves what a species is, and we need to differentiate the term species from population. A population is a group of interbreeding or at least potentially interbreeding individuals. And so up here on our diagram, we might have several plants, and this could be maybe plants within a mile of each other, let's say, maybe closer, maybe further away, but close enough that pollen could be spread from one to another or from here to here, such that these plants can interbreed. That maybe this plant never actually interbreeds with this one, but at least there's the potential to do so. Maybe this one actually breeds with this one, and this one with this one. The important thing is that there's some way for all of these plants to be exchanging genes with each other due to interbreeding. For plants to be able to interbreed, because they can't move around, that must mean that they are geographically close to each other. Now, pollinators might fly somewhere on the order of miles, and sometimes wind will disperse pollen even longer distances. But generally speaking, if plants are more than a few miles apart, it becomes unlikely that they will regularly share pollen with one another. So here's a population. Now let's talk about species. Species are all individuals of all populations that both have similar traits and that could interbreed with each other if they were brought together. So to see this, we already said that this group up here could be one population. And they're close enough together that they could interbreed. But somewhere over here, maybe this is on another island or far apart on the same continent, maybe there's another group of these individuals. These can breed with each other, so can these, but it is going to be exceedingly rare or never that we get breeding from one of these plants up here to any of the plants down here. This is basically not happening. So then we can say these are two different populations, but they have similar traits. They look similar. In fact, because I copied the same picture, they look identical. Moreover, if we did an experiment and we actually brought some of the plants from this second population up to this first population, then they would be able to interbreed. Their traits are similar enough to each other, it would be possible. Therefore, we can say that they are the same species, even though they are never actually interbreeding in nature. So that's a species. Again, the important thing is similar traits and the potential for interbreeding. We're now going to talk about our two different modes of speciation that your book talks about. The first one we're not going to say much about. It's probably less important, and from my perspective, it's less interesting. But because your book talks about it, we will at least go over it. This is phyletic speciation. And this refers to a process where slowly over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, one species acquires new traits. And over that time period, it's a lot of small gradual changes, so we never can really say the point where that one species becomes a second species. But if we look at far enough times apart, let's say in this example, 10 million years ago compared to 1 million years ago compared to today, we get a slow accumulation of changes that leads today's individuals to be very different than they were 10 million years ago, even though we can see this gradual change. Well, if the traits are very different today than 10 million years ago, then by our earlier definition of species, which said they had to have similar traits, we would no longer consider these the same species. Could they interbreed? Well, in theory, maybe if we had a time machine, we could test that. In practice with phyletic speciation, we're usually going to have to speculate about that question. But if we see big enough differences, we could call them new species, and that is phyletic speciation. We're now going to move on to what, again, I think is the more important process, and this is divergent speciation. In divergent speciation, what's happening is one species is becoming two species. And so you can imagine we have some ancestral species, maybe one population, and then something happens, and we'll talk about the possibilities. But some members of that initial population, for some reason, start acquiring new traits, and we can perhaps illustrate this with some slightly different colors. So whatever blue represents, maybe their flower color has changed. And this other members of this initial population, again, for reasons we'll talk about, acquire some different traits. And so maybe they get a little bit purple. And if these differences in traits are substantial, and if they prevent these two species from being able to interbreed, then we can say this one species has diverged into two new species. So I've already said this can happen for a couple of different reasons. The first of these reasons is geographical divergence. And that name really tells you what it is. It's when populations become separated due to geography. Oh, geographical. Looks like I have a spelling issue there. So these populations become separated. How could this happen? One way is that a population could disperse long distances. For example, we have some population over here, but then due to some unusual event, maybe a big rainstorm, or maybe some seed gets lucky and lands on the log and that log floats across an ocean, we can get one or a few of these individuals dispersing really far away into some area where subsequent dispersal is unlikely. And so now we have a new population over here. We could also have barriers arise. And so that would look something more like this. Let's imagine we had a species, or rather a population of a species, and it occurs all throughout this region. But then some geological event happens. Maybe two continents collide and we get the formation of some mountains. And so we'll have some orange mountains in the middle here. And now, because the plants can't grow on these mountaintops, we've functionally separated the one previous population into two populations. Other possibilities, we could have a river form through the middle instead of a mountain chain, or we could have a new sea open up, make it a little bit wider, a little bit more like a sea. Or we could have conditions change such that we get something like a desert forming in the middle, a desert that's not inhabitable by the plant population. Whichever of those barriers arise, the important thing now is there is not a way for genes to get exchanged from over here to over here. And again, if we cannot get gene exchange, then these two, what are now two new populations, will start to diverge in their own directions. Why will they diverge? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, they could diverge based on genetic drift, just random changes in each of those populations that don't have anything to do with fitness. A second possibility is that they could experience different selection pressures. So let's imagine in this example up here that on this northern side of the mountain, temperatures are a little bit colder and it's better to flower a little bit later in the spring. So up here, it flowers later. And then down here, let's imagine it's warmer and we get selection to flower earlier in the spring, closer to the winter time that just ended. Now, let's imagine that something else changes in the geography. Maybe this river dries up or the mountains erode, and we have a pathway now where we could get pollen moving back and forth between these two sides. So this opens up. Pollen can move that way and pollen can move this way. But during the time that these populations were separate, they became different. In this example, their flowering times changed. And so now this one's flowering in March, this one's flowering in June, and even if pollen could move back and forth, they now are different enough that they will not be able to pollinate one another because they don't overlap in the trait. And so now we can say that they've diverged into different species as a result, at least initially, of this geographic barrier. And so we just talked about this last point. Even if the populations rejoin, then they will no longer be successful at interbreeding. If that's happened, we've had divergent speciation. Let's look at an example of this. The example that we'll look at is isolating barriers in the Andes Mountains. Remember, the Andes Mountains are along the west coast of South America. And something kind of cool happens with mountains. At the highest elevations, up here on the tops of the mountains, trees can't grow. It's above the tree line, and so it's either too cold or too windy, or there's not enough water. And then down beneath this, trees can grow, and you can see that on these slopes. There's also big changes in temperature and other conditions. And so a plant that can grow up at the tops will probably do really badly growing down these slopes. What this does is it creates non-forested peaks separated by a sea of low elevation forest. It's not literally water, but it's like water in that it's large and unbroken. And so this means that if we have a plant that gets isolated over here on one of the peaks, maybe there's a population, then if somehow, let's imagine there's an unusual event where some of the seeds disperse over to here, and so we get establishment of seeds over here. As long as those dispersal events are very rare, then these plants over here will be isolated from these plants, and they can each evolve in their own directions. So we have evolution here, we get divergent speciation. Then the cool part about this is climate changes over time. So let's imagine we go through a cold period, and the cold period forces these trees completely out of this valley. They retreat to somewhere even lower elevation elsewhere. When that happens, that's going to create a path where this population can migrate over to other peaks, up to here and up to here. I should have color-coded this. But at the same time, this population, let's make this one that was over here orange, it can migrate in the other direction. Now, if these were isolated for long enough, they've become different species with some different traits. So now up on this peak, we have both the orange and the blue species. We also have the orange and the blue species over on this far peak. And so we lost our color coding, but if we had two over here and two over here, each of those could evolve over time until they became separate species on the far peak than the near peak. That would give us a total of 4 species, 2 on the near and 2 on the far peak. And you can imagine that process happening repeatedly, such that our 4 species, after migrating again, could become 8 species, and those 8 could become 16, etc. So for this reason, mountain peaks and islands are 2 of the areas where we tend to get high speciation rates. To emphasize that, let's see what happened here in the Andes Mountains. With this particular group of lupines that we're talking about, and you can see pictures of some of the lupines here along the outside of our map, we got one initial species that diverged into a total of 81 separate species in a period of less than 2 million years. That is incredibly fast by evolutionary time. Oftentimes, we might only get one species diverging into 2 during this time period. So there's something about this unusual system of peaks that are separated that really leads to a higher speciation rate. And these plants look very different than one another. So you can see that some of them are small trees, like this one up here. Some of them are plants that just sort of lie flat on the ground and are not woody at all, like this one, and they can form cushions, or they can be medium-sized plants or shrubs, so all sorts of variety. So once each of these peaks becomes isolated, then the plants can evolve to the conditions on their particular peak, and then they can move elsewhere, but their form will stay similar when they do move. So not only do we get many species, we can get many different forms as a result of this isolation. We've been talking about geographical divergence. So this was all based on the fact that things were happening on different peaks. We can also have a similar process happen due to biological speciation. In this process, we're going to see that differences in traits between 2 parts of a population can maintain isolation even when the ranges overlap. Let me just add parts of here. Parts of a population can maintain isolation even when ranges overlap. And so this is easiest to understand with an example. Let's imagine that we had some population of flowers, and on one side of the population, flowers looked more like this. They were pinkish and wide. On the other side of the population, flowers looked more like this. They are reddish and narrow. Well, it turns out that bees like these wide flowers with a place to land and a fairly big opening so they can crawl in and get the nectar and pollen. It turns out that hummingbirds really like narrow flowers. They like them narrow so they can see around the edges and watch for approaching predators. And they like having narrow openings because that means the bees can't steal the nectar, and the hummingbirds can stick their tongues in and drink the nectar. And so, because these flowers have different forms, the red ones are going to tend to get pollinated by hummingbirds, the pink ones by bees. But this also means that they are unlikely to ever exchange pollen with one another. The bee flowers will mate with bee flowers, hummingbird flowers will mate with hummingbird flowers. These flowers are interfertile. What that means is that if you by hand take pollen from this one and apply it to this one, you'll get an intermediate flower. You can see this is halfway in between, brighter pink and a slightly wider opening, but not quite this wide. But in nature, this doesn't happen very much because the pollinators have strong preferences. And so even if these were in the same population and very near each other, we could still get a process of speciation. The red ones would continue mating and continue becoming more and more hummingbird friendly. The pink ones would become more bee friendly. That would make it less and less likely that we would get these intermediates. Eventually, they would be different enough in their traits that they would be completely unlikely to mate, and we could call them different species. So that's an example of biological speciation happening based on different attractiveness to pollinators. Another way that this could happen we alluded to earlier. Let's imagine that some flowers bloom early and some flowers bloom late. The early flowers will tend to bloom with other early ones, but that can maintain early flowering or even push it earlier. The late ones will bloom with later ones. Again, that can maintain late flowering in those or even push it later. And as a result, as long as there aren't too many in the middle, then along a timeline, we could have, this is our timeline, maybe March through June. We have this group that tends to mate with other members of this group because they're early flowers. We have this other group that tends to mate with other later flowers. And this can then allow other changes between the two groups to occur because there's no pollen exchange. And so over time, this can give us two different species. So that's another example of biological speciation based on flowering time. Incidentally, these are monkey flowers, and monkey flowers are used in a lot of studies of evolutionary biology. When we have a lot of speciation happening in a small amount of time, we'll call this an adaptive radiation. Usually, part of an adaptive radiation is going to be not only many species forming, but those species having different traits. And we saw that just a minute ago. The example, let me see if I can go back to it here, with the Andean lupines and all of these different plant forms is an adaptive radiation because these plants are adapted probably to colder or warmer, wetter or drier conditions, maybe sunnier and less sunny too. Another example of an adaptive radiation is the silver swords, which are a group of plants we mentioned in the previous lecture that occur on Hawaii. And these are about 30 or so closely related species that all diverged from one common ancestor. That one ancestor diverged into two, and then those two diverged probably into four, etc. That happened several times to get up to the total number. And in this divergence, we get not only many species, but a range of different plant forms. So you can see there's some low plants that act as a ground cover, like down here. There are some herbaceous plants that look kind of tufty like grass. There are some medium-sized plants. There are some vine-like plants. I believe this is a vine growing through the tree, not part of the tree itself. And even cooler, there are ones that have diverged into trees. And so this has happened in a short amount of time, and it has involved many species as well as many different plant forms. And so this makes it an adaptive radiation. Why did radiation happen here? Well, this is similar to the mountain peaks. Remember that Hawaii is a series of islands. There's many of them, but there's a few larger ones. And so each time a plant population can disperse from one island, let's say here, let's get a color that's easier to see. Here we are. If it's an unusual event that will not happen often, but very, very occasionally, a plant will succeed in dispersing to a new island. When it does, it becomes isolated, and upon becoming isolated, it can diverge into a new species. And given enough time, its traits will differ, so that if it does manage to disperse back to the initial island, it still will not be able to breed with with the species that it initially was similar to. So one species has now diverged into two, and you can imagine this process happening over and over. So this purple species could disperse again, and again it becomes isolated on its new island. It diverges into a new species. We now have 3 species, but this one could diverge back this way, or disperse back, and if it did, it would be separate, and it would be separate from the ones on the island from which it came. So if it ever dispersed back again in this direction, it would now be another new species. And I won't do this ad infinitum, but you get the idea that by having frequent dispersal events and then isolation, we can get many speciation events occurring. And on these islands, because there were not a lot of species to start with, there were a lot of available niches, or a lot of available ways a plant could grow that would be successful. For example, being a vine, or a tree, or a ground cover. And so that's part of what let this one species diverge into so many different growth forms. That being specifically that there was not a lot of competition from other plants that already had those growth forms. We're going to move on to phylogenetics, which is the study of relationships among plant species. And so I've been telling you, for example, that the silver swords diverged from one plant species into 30, but how do we know that? Well, we're not going to go into details, but the general idea is that we hypothesize relationships among species. We never really know them because we weren't there to observe what happened. Instead, we're around today looking at what's there, and we're making informed guesses or hypotheses. So we will hypothesize relationships based on similarities in traits among species. Species that are very similar are probably more closely related. Ones that are more different are less closely related. When we do this, we're not going to treat all traits equally. Instead, we are especially interested in traits that are shared between species because the trait evolved in a shared ancestor. And that's kind of a mouthful, but it'll be easier to understand when we look at the phylogeny. So let's just keep that thought and we'll come back to it on our phylogeny. There's some kinds of traits that we especially want to ignore. First, we want to ignore traits that are present in multiple of the species because they were present in the common ancestor of all members of that group. If the trait was there historically in the very first species, then it's not going to tell us anything about the relationships among the species that diverged from that first species. To give you an example of this, if we think back to the very first silver sword, let's say it had, I don't know, let's say that it had the ability to make wood and to either grow as a shrub or a tree. If that was true of the very first ones that came to this island, then we can't use that trait of being able to make wood to understand which ones are related to which other ones. They all ancestrally had that trait. But we could use the fact that some of them have lost that trait to understand relationships. So we could say this one does not make wood, and this one does not make wood. If that's the case, then if these two both don't make wood, that's some evidence that they might be more closely related to each other than they are to other silver swords on the island. So we said we ignore traits that were present in the very first common ancestor. That was this point. We also will ignore traits that are shared by species due to convergent evolution. Let's define convergent evolution. This is what occurs when a similar environment selects for similar traits in different groups. So similar selection, different groups. And to make this easy, let's just think of some examples you're familiar with. Birds, bats, and insects all have wings. That's not a surprise to you. But think about it, they're not very closely related to each other. Birds are more closely related to lizards than either of these other groups. Bats are mammals and are more closely related to other rodents. And insects are related to other arthropods, much more closely than either of these other groups. So the fact that these all have wings is not telling us anything about their relationships to each other. So when we are using similar traits to decide that things are more closely related, we try to ignore traits where we think the trait is there because of convergent evolution. As another example, since this is a plant course, let's do a plant example. We've talked about the fact that cacti and euphorbs, these were the plants that grow in African deserts. Both of these have thick cuticles, thick stems, and thorns. This is not because they're closely related. In fact, they're not close relatives. It's because they both live in deserts, and these three traits are useful for plants living in deserts. So again, we wouldn't use these traits to try to figure out whether these plant groups are close relatives or not. And the second part here just says what I just said verbally here. So let's talk about how we depict relationships. What we have here is a phylogeny, and we've looked at these earlier in the semester. Remember, this is a depiction of our hypotheses about relationships among species. And we can tell whichever side the tips are on, that's the side that is the most recent in time. So we can draw an arrow representing time, something like this. Trying to draw it vertically. And, whoops, the top of the arrow. This is ancient. Okay, you get the idea. I'm just going to write A and C. And this is the present day, but it's faster just to write now. And so that's the direction time has changed. Branches that diverge near the tip up here are recent events, and divergence events down here are more ancient events. So here's the most recent event on the Angeas, actually this is a phylogeny of all land plants. The most recent event depicted here is the split between gymnosperms, the cone plants, and angiosperms, the flowering plants. Our very first split on this tree was the split between the charophyte algae and the terrestrial plants. So we said on the previous slide that we would ignore traits in the common ancestor when figuring out relationships. An example of this would be the charophytes lack a well-developed cuticle. That's also true of the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, but that doesn't tell us they're close relatives of each other, because it's true in the common ancestor of the entire group. So we would not use that trying to figure out relationships. However, we can say that the lycophytes, ferns, and seed plants, the gymnosperms and angiosperms, do have a well-developed cuticle. So that's a trait that was not present in the ancestral species. So we can use that to tell us that the lycophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms are relatively closer relatives. So if it's a new trait that is shared among some members of the group, that's evidence for relationship. But if it's a trait that's there because it was in the common ancestor, that is not evidence. And as we already said, that's the common ancestor of everything on this phylogeny. Okay, so we are going to move on and talk about how we actually name species, in part using information on phylogenies. And this we'll call the taxonomic hierarchy. So we're going to name groups based on relatedness. In theory, at least, we want all members of each group to be more closely related to other members of that group than they are to any other group. When we do this, we're going to give groups names at a variety of levels. Some groups are going to be small and very closely related to each other. Other groups are going to have more members or be larger. When we say larger, we mean more members. But a consequence of that is that the members will be less closely related to other members of the group. Looking at this on the phylogeny, then small groups like this have fewer members. In this case, it's two groups of plants, and those two groups of plants are fairly closely related. So that could get a name. We could also give a name to this entire group. Now we've got more members, but the members are less closely related to each other. And if we gave a name to all of the things on this tree, then we'd have even more members, but they would be even less closely related. Okay, so let's go on and talk about how we actually give names to plants. We are going to use hopefully a hierarchy that you are familiar with, and it goes in order from the largest group to the smallest group. Kingdom, phylum, but for whatever reason, botanists use the word division instead of phylum. So kingdom, phylum or division, class, order, family, genus, species. And you might have been taught at some point, King Philip came over for good spaghetti as a way of memorizing the order here. With the first letter of each of those words, K, P, C, O, F, G, S. Again, King Philip came over for good spaghetti, being the same as the first letters of these words. And in each of these levels, if we start with the smallest, the next level up is going to be bigger. So we've talked about what a species is already. A genus may have only one, but usually it will have multiple species. A family will usually have multiple genera, which is the plural of genus. Orders typically have multiple families. Classes usually have multiple orders. Phylum or divisions usually have multiple classes. And kingdoms always have multiple divisions. When we use these names, there are some rules. I'm not going to teach you all of them, but I'm going to tell you a few of them that will help us recognize what level in the hierarchy we are talking about. So family names in plants usually end with the letters A, C, E, A, E. So for example, if you were to see the word Brassicaceae, then you would know this must be the name of a family because it ends with ACEAE. The genus is always written with a capital letter and italicized. The genus can stand by itself. When it was initially, the idea was come up with, then we thought about this as being a noun. The species is going to be the name of the genus plus a word that acts as an adjective to tell you which member of the genus. So when we're referring to a species, we can't just use the second word by itself because it's like using an adjective without that adjective modifying anything. Instead, you always have to include the genus name and the species name. And just like the genus was italicized, we italicize the genus and species name when we're writing the genus and species. So with the species, include the genus name and italicize it. Notice we don't italicize any of the names higher up on the list. And so here's an example with an actual plant. This is the eastern white pine, which we talked about when we did the conifer lab, or the gymnosperms lab rather. And its name is Pinus strobus. Notice capitalized and italicized. And this is one particular pine. So if Pinus strobus is the species, then obviously Pinus is the genus. Usually the higher levels get their name from one of the members of a lower level, and we'll see that's very obvious here. So the family is called Pinaceae because it includes the genus Pinus. And again, here's the ACEAE ending. The order is Pinales. The class is Pinopsida. And then we get into a name that doesn't come from the word pine. This is Tracheophyta, and the tracheo part is reminding us of the vasculature. So these are literally the plants with vasculature, or the vascular plants. That is our phylum, or as we call it with plants, the division. And then finally we get up to the kingdom Plantae, which is going to include all plants. Some final thoughts from today's lecture. First, speciation is super important. All plants, literally every single species of plant, came from speciation events starting with only one species around 500 million years ago. We had that first species that colonized land, and then something happened that allowed that one species to become two, and that process repeated over and over again. Now, what allowed this to happen? Well, it largely reflects the fact that there were many available habitat types. Once plant got onto land, there were dry places and wet places, and mountainous places and flat, and different kinds of soil. So this allows many different plant species to coexist. Additionally, there was lots of opportunities for isolation, especially as continents moved, and as plants moved inland and got away from the shoreline, then they could become isolated from one another. There are, depending on the estimates, there's certainly more than 100,000, and there's probably more than 200,000 species of angiosperms. And so with this, and this is only the angiosperms, not even considering the ferns and gymnosperms and other groups. So with all of this diversity, it's necessary to have a way of organizing our understanding of relationships. And that's why the taxonomic hierarchy is so important. It's very rigid. It has a certain number of levels and formalized ways of assigning names. But despite this rigidity, it's helpful because it gives us a consistent way of referring to plants where we know exactly what plant somebody is talking about when they tell us its name within the taxonomic hierarchy.